a locked drawer, a vanished file, and a mayor who won't talk. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I'm your host, Silas Wren. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from today? Your comments mean the world to me. Let's dive in. Chief Inspector Jules Amédée François Maigret stood at the window of his modest apartment, his gaze lost in the rhythmic fall of rain against the glass. The streets of Paris below were slick with water, the lamplights casting soft halos through the mist. It was an evening like so many others, quiet, introspective, and undeniably solitary. The world outside moved with a disjointed rhythm. A child's laugh echoed from somewhere in the distance. A door creaked and a pair of shoes splashed through the puddles. The sounds of Paris at rest, before the frenzy of the night would awaken. Inside it was warm. The soft hum of the electric heater in the corner created a peaceful background to his thoughts. Maigret had no plans for the evening. His wife, Louise, was away visiting her sister in the countryside, and Maigret had long since learned to find comfort in solitude. His life, much like the apartment, was orderly, quiet, a calm refuge from the relentless hum of the city. The telephone sat beside him on the small, scratched desk, its black receiver a constant reminder that no matter how still the world felt, it could always be shaken into motion. He reached for the glass of cognac on the table, sipping slowly. The glass warmed his hand, a small pleasure in the evening's chill. A sharp knock at the door interrupted the moment. Maigret stood and walked toward it with his usual slow, deliberate pace, pausing for just a moment before he opened it. At the threshold stood his colleague, Inspector Lognon. The man looked out of breath, his coat dripping with rainwater, and his expression, typically downcast, seemed unusually heavy tonight. "Maigret," Lognon said without preamble. "There's been a killing, a troubling one." Maigret's hand lingered on the doorframe for a moment before he nodded and stepped aside. "Come in, Lognon. It's a wet night. Sit down. Have a drink." Lognon shook his head, a flicker of irritation passing across his face. "I don't have time for that. I need you to come with me. It's the mayor." The mention of the mayor immediately shifted Maigret's mood, though he did not let it show. In his line of work, the name of an official meant complications, and complications meant no simple answers. "The mayor?" Maigret asked, his voice low and measured. Lognon hesitated before speaking again, his eyes darting to the side as if he were searching for the words. "The mayor of Montargis, dead, a shot to the chest. They found him in his office. And there's something else, something about the desk. We think it's connected. I don't know how, but there's a secret there. They want you on this one. It's not your usual case, Maigret." Maigret stared at Lognon for a long moment, then reached for his coat, pulling it from the back of his chair. He slipped it on with methodical precision, as if the simplicity of the task allowed him to think more clearly. He didn't speak as they left the apartment, descending the stairwell with Lognon trailing behind. They moved through the darkened corridors of the building in silence, their steps muffled against the old wooden floorboards. The rain had intensified by the time they reached the car. Maigret slid into the passenger seat, pulling the collar of his coat higher against the wetness. As the car moved slowly through the Paris streets, he let his mind drift, but only slightly. He was already beginning to piece together a picture. A man like the mayor, public but closed off, hiding something. It was always the quiet ones who had the most to hide. "Do you know anything about this secret?" Maigret asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the window as the rain blurred the streetlights into golden smears. Lognon shifted uneasily in his seat. "Not much. But there's something about a letter, one that the mayor wrote but never sent. Some mention of corruption. I don't know the details, but it's in the office near his desk. No one can figure out why it wasn't sent. The letter was never found. Not yet, anyway." The car slowed as they neared the outskirts of Montargis. The dimly lit town stretched out before them, streets narrow and winding, like veins threading through a body that had seen too much. As they turned onto the main square, Maigret could feel the weight of the town's secrecy pressing in around him. They reached the town hall, a crumbling building standing stoic against the night. The outside lights flickered, casting long shadows across the courtyard. A uniformed officer stood at the entrance, his face pale under the flood of rain, his expression unreadable. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and the quiet murmur of voices. Maigret's shoes clicked sharply against the marble floors as he walked down the hallway toward the mayor's office. It was a simple room, elegant but not extravagant, filled with the trappings of an ordinary politician's life. A sturdy desk, a chair behind it that was now empty, the remains of a dinner half finished on the table. "Where is he?" Maigret asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. A young officer, his eyes wide with fear, gestured toward the desk. "Right there, Chief Inspector. It's in the drawer." Maigret stepped forward, bending to examine the drawer of the mayor's desk. He didn't touch anything at first. He simply observed. The way the drawer was slightly ajar, the faint smell of paper, the peculiar absence of the usual clutter that might accompany a man in power. He opened it slowly, just enough to see inside. And there, hidden beneath some papers, was a letter. Maigret picked it up without saying a word, his fingers tracing the edges. He knew this was the beginning of something far more complicated than a simple murder. The truth was hidden, but not in the way the world expected it to be. He closed the drawer quietly. "Lognon," Maigret said, his voice soft. "I think we've only just started." And so the case began. Maigret stood quietly in the mayor's office, the letter still resting in his hand. The paper felt thin, its edges curling slightly from being tucked away for who knew how long. He glanced at Lognon, who was waiting just behind him, visibly tense. Maigret's eyes lingered on the desk for a moment longer, the weight of the room pressing down on him as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "Read it," Lognon said, his voice tight with urgency. "Do you think it's the clue?" Maigret didn't answer immediately. He wasn't interested in hasty conclusions. He had learned long ago that truth didn't arrive in a rush. It came in small fragments, often hidden beneath the surface. He placed the letter carefully on the desk, looking around the room one last time as if searching for something the others had missed. "Don't jump to conclusions, Lognon," Maigret said quietly. "We'll read it when the time is right. For now, we observe." Lognon shifted uncomfortably but nodded, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He was young, eager to solve the mystery, but Maigret knew he had to temper that eagerness with caution. This wasn't the sort of case where a quick burst of action would yield results. It required something far subtler, patience. Maigret turned toward the door, motioning for Lognon to follow him. They walked down the narrow hallways of the town hall, their footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent building. The officers standing guard were tense, whispering in hushed tones among themselves, unsure of their next step. Maigret could sense their unease, but he wasn't bothered by it. They would find their way just as he would. Once outside, the cold air hit Maigret's face like a slap, and the rain began to fall harder. It wasn't the kind of rain that soaked you through in an instant. It was the kind that wore you down slowly, making everything feel damp, heavy, and inescapable. It was a perfect night for a mystery. They made their way to a nearby cafe, the dim glow from the windows offering a brief respite from the chill. Maigret ordered his usual, a simple coffee, and sat down at the corner table, his mind already working on the details he had gathered. He didn't need much to start piecing things together, just the smallest of observations. Lognon sat across from him, glancing down at the letter in his hands. "Do you think the mayor was killed because of it?" he asked. "The letter. It could be connected, right? Maigret didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the steam rising from his coffee, watching it curl upward, the silence of the moment settling in. The answer wasn't in the letter, not entirely. It was in how people reacted to the letter, what they did when they saw it or what they failed to do. "It's too soon to say," Maigret said after a moment. "But I don't think this was an ordinary killing. There's something personal about it, something beneath the surface. And we have to look beyond the obvious." Lognon was about to speak again when the door to the cafe swung open and a figure stepped inside, shaking off the rain. It was an officer from the town hall, his face ashen and his posture stiff. He moved quickly toward Maigret's table, his boots tapping against the floor in a hurried, nervous rhythm. "Inspector Maigret," the officer said, his voice tight. There's something you need to see. It's in the mayor's private office." Maigret stood up immediately, his mind already shifting into the investigative mode he had perfected over the years. He could feel Lognon's unease, but he gave no indication that he was in any hurry. The officer's urgency didn't match the calm of the evening, and that alone made Maigret cautious. "What is it?" Maigret asked, keeping his tone neutral. The officer hesitated, glancing at Lognon before speaking. "There's something strange, Inspector. We found a safe hidden behind the mayor's desk. Locked, but we opened it. Inside, there's more. A few documents, but also something else. Something we didn't expect. Maigret raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. What is it? The officer swallowed hard. It's a small box, sir. A box with a lock. No one knew it was there. We haven't opened it yet. We thought we should wait for you. Maigret turned to Lognon, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. Let's go, Lognon. It seems our night has just begun. The drive back to the town hall felt like an eternity, the rain pounding against the roof of the car, each drop adding to the sense of inevitability that hung in the air. Maigret's thoughts were focused, but not on the box. It was the people, the ones who had known the mayor. Those were the pieces that would ultimately make sense of it all. Once inside the mayor's office, Maigret wasted no time in inspecting the safe. The officers had cleared the room, leaving only Maigret and Lognon to study the contents. Maigret took a moment, his hands resting on the edge of the desk as he surveyed the scene. The safe itself was small, inconspicuous. It had been carefully hidden behind a false panel in the wall, a clever way to keep unwanted eyes from prying. He could feel the subtle hum of tension in the room as the officers stood by, waiting for him to make his move. Maigret glanced at Lognon, who was standing nearby, impatient and eager to open the box. But Maigret could already sense the trickle of doubt rising in his gut. He nodded for the officer to open it. As the box was revealed, Maigret's eyes narrowed. There was something about it, something about the way it had been concealed that felt deliberate. He didn't reach for the box right away. Instead, he glanced over at the officers, each one standing quietly in the corner, watching but not speaking. Let's see what's inside, Maigret murmured. He opened the box slowly, carefully. The contents were simple, unremarkable. A handful of letters and documents, but nestled among them was something else. A small worn photograph. Maigret's heart sank, but he said nothing as he picked it up and studied the image. A man, a familiar face, standing beside the mayor. The photograph was old, the edges curling and faded. But the man's face was unmistakable, someone Maigret had seen before, someone connected to the mayor. Maigret's mind began to race, but he kept his expression unreadable. He placed the photograph back into the box and closed it gently. We've only scratched the surface, Maigret said softly. Lognon looked up at him, confused. Who is he? Maigret didn't answer right away. He was already thinking ahead, piecing together the implications. That, Lognon, is the next piece of the puzzle. The office fell silent as Maigret gently placed the box back on the desk, his fingers lingering for a moment on the worn surface. He could feel Lognon's curiosity pressing against him like an invisible weight. But Maigret wasn't about to rush. This case wasn't something that would reveal itself in a single moment of clarity. It was a series of quiet steps, each one leading toward a destination that remained for now obscured. Who is he? Lognon asked again, his voice tight, the impatience in his tone now matched by a slight tremor in his hands. The photograph seemed to have unsettled him as much as it had Maigret. Maigret leaned back in his chair, eyes still fixed on the photograph. He could feel the subtle tension that ran through the room, the uneasy energy of men who were in over their heads, hoping for a quick resolution. But Maigret knew better. This wasn't a matter of simply finding the right name or the right connection. It was about understanding the space between them, the things left unsaid, the moments not witnessed, the choices made in the shadows. He took a slow breath, pushing his thoughts into a form he could explain. The man in the photo is someone I've seen before, a face that lingers in the background of other cases, other moments. He's not a stranger to the city. He's part of it, a piece of the same fabric. Lognon frowned, still unsure. But what does he have to do with the mayor's death? Maigret's eyes flicked to the safe, then back to the officer. That's what we need to find out. The mayor's death wasn't a random act. It's connected to something deeper, something personal. He paused, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. There's always a story beneath the story, Lognon. We just have to listen to it. With the photograph safely tucked away in an envelope, Maigret stood up. Let's go back to the mayor's house. We'll start there. The journey to the mayor's residence was quiet, the car cutting through the rain-soaked streets of Montargis with a steady hum. Maigret's mind worked methodically, as it always did, following the clues like ripples on water. He wasn't sure where they would lead, but he knew they would eventually converge somewhere. if he was patient enough to wait for them. Longyon sat beside him, his fingers nervously drumming against his knees. Maigret had grown used to his colleagues fidgeting, the younger officer's need to fill every silence with motion. It was a trait Maigret had observed in many young detectives eager for results, but lacking the calm required to truly understand a case. As they reached the mayor's house, Maigret stepped out into the cold air. The house was large, but it was a house of a certain kind. Grand but not ostentatious, a residence that conveyed power without drawing attention to itself. It was the kind of home that gave off the impression of being entirely ordinary, a place where nothing remarkable happened. Except now, of course, it had. They were greeted at the door by the mayor's widow, a woman who appeared as composed as one could be in such circumstances. Her eyes were red, but she wore no sign of hysterics, her movements smooth and controlled. Maigret had always found something quietly unsettling about people who handled tragedy with such calm. It wasn't that he suspected them of anything. It was just that he knew something else was often hidden beneath that still surface. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft, the syllables weighted with a kind of resignation. "I didn't expect you so soon. I'm not sure what more I can tell you. I told the officers everything I know." Maigret didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her with his usual quiet scrutiny, searching for anything that might betray a hint of something she hadn't shared. "I'm sure you've told them everything you know, Madame Mayor," he said after a moment, "but I need to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind. About your husband. About what he was doing in the days leading up to his death." She nodded slowly, her face pale but composed. "Of course, please come inside." Inside, the house smelled faintly of incense and dried flowers. It was the kind of smell that lingered, comforting in its familiarity, but almost too sweet in the way it filled the room. Maigret followed her through the hallway, his steps measured and deliberate, his eyes taking in every detail as they passed. Small things, like the way the curtains were drawn just slightly too tight, or the absence of any personal photographs on the walls. The house felt more like a well-kept stage set than a home. Nothing seemed out of place, but it all felt just a little off. They entered the study, where Maigret had expected to find something significant. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a desk lamp, and there, sitting on the desk, was the mayor's chair, still spinning slightly, as though someone had just risen from it. Maigret approached the desk slowly, his eyes scanning the clutter of papers, the remnants of a half-finished meal. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that screamed murder. Your husband's desk. "Was he often in here?" Maigret asked, his voice low and calm. "Yes," she replied, her gaze moving to the desk, then back to him. "He worked long hours. He was always busy. The business of the town, you know. He was very dedicated to his work. And did he ever speak to you about any threats? Anyone who might have wished him harm?" She hesitated for a moment, the slightest quiver in her lips betraying a flicker of emotion. "No, never. He was a very private man. He kept his thoughts to himself even when he came home." Maigret turned, his gaze settling on the shelf above the desk. Books lined it neatly, most of them on municipal matters, law and history. But one book stood out. It was small, leather-bound, and tucked just behind a stack of documents as though it had been purposefully hidden. He reached for it, pulling it free with a smooth motion. "What's this?" he asked, flipping it open to the first page. Her reaction was immediate, too quick. She swallowed hard, her face flushing slightly. I'm not sure. It's just a book from his collection." Maigret studied her carefully. "It seems to be more than that." Longyon stepped forward, leaning in to take a closer look at the book. Maigret was already turning the pages, his mind working in quiet pieces, understanding that this was another layer of the puzzle, a layer he hadn't anticipated, but one that was now as clear as the rain outside. The pages were filled with names. Names Maigret recognized, and others that were unfamiliar. But there was one thing that stood out more than anything else. Every name had been underlined, some more heavily than others, as if marking something important. Maigret's fingers froze on the page. "These are the names of your husband's colleagues, aren't they?" Her breath caught. "Yes, some of them." Maigret closed the book slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "You said your husband was dedicated to his work. But this," he said softly, "this isn't just work. This is something else entirely." And Maigret knew without a doubt that the mayor had been hiding more than just secrets. He had been hiding people whose names were now intertwined with his death. Maigret closed the book gently, his fingers lingering on the worn leather cover as he studied the mayor's widow. The tension in the room had shifted, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. He could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the flush in her cheeks, and the way her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together in her lap. The moment was delicate. Maigret knew better than to push too hard, but the slip in her demeanor spoke volumes. There was something in that book, something hidden in plain sight. "Madame Mayor," he said, his voice calm but insistent, "these names, are they connected to your husband's work? Were they friends? Colleagues?" She nodded quickly, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "Yes, they were his colleagues. We often had people over for dinner, political events, meetings. Some of them were close friends. Others were more business acquaintances." "Business acquaintances," Maigret repeated, his gaze steady. "Were any of these people involved in the mayor's dealings outside of his official capacity? Something more personal, perhaps?" Her eyes flicked away from his, focusing on the floor, and Maigret could see that this was no longer a simple matter of political alliances. There were layers to this, secretive layers she wasn't prepared to reveal. "Look, Inspector," she said, her voice dropping in volume, almost pleading, "I didn't know about any of this. My husband, he didn't involve me in his work. He kept his affairs to himself. I never asked questions." "I didn't want to know," Maigret observed her carefully. He had seen this before, the defensive posture, the way she deflected the accusation without fully denying it. "Madame, your husband's death wasn't a random act of violence. Someone killed him, and the people in that book. These business acquaintances of his, they're part of this puzzle." Her hands tightened in her lap, her fingers digging into the fabric of her dress. Maigret could see the conflict in her expression. She wasn't just worried about the mayor's death. She was terrified of something else, something buried deep, just beyond her reach. "I didn't want to know," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you must," Maigret said gently, "if you want to find the truth." The room fell silent for a long moment, and then, almost as if resigned to the inevitable, she spoke again. There were whispers. "The mayor, he was involved in something with some of these men. I didn't understand it at first. He became distant in the last few months, more secretive. He had meetings that I wasn't allowed to know about. He'd come home late at night, sometimes not even telling me where he'd been. He'd look at me with that same expression he always had when he was hiding something. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know." Maigret leaned forward, his gaze never leaving her face. "Did he ever mention anyone in particular? Someone who might have had a motive, a reason to want him dead?" She shook her head slowly, as if the question itself caused her physical pain. No, he didn't, but there was one man. A man who came by the house not long ago. A man he'd been meeting secretly. I didn't see him often, only a few times, but I heard his voice through the walls when they spoke. He was very forceful, I think. He wanted something from my husband. I could hear it in the tone of his voice, even though I couldn't make out the words. Maigret's mind began to move with precision. He was building a picture, but it was still incomplete, like a map with only a few roads drawn on it. This man, the one who had visited the house, who had spoken in hushed tones, was a piece of the puzzle, and Maigret was determined to find out who he was. "Do you remember anything about him?" "His name, his appearance? No, I didn't see him clearly. He was always in the shadows when I came into the room. He was tall, though, broad-shouldered, and he had a strange accent. Not like the others." Maigret nodded slowly, piecing together the fragments of information. A mysterious man with an accent. That wasn't much to go on, but it was something. The clues, though vague, were starting to converge. "Do you know where he went after his visits?" She shook her head again, her face pale. "No, I never asked. He left quietly, and my husband would never speak about him. But I remember hearing the sound of a car, an expensive one. The engine, it roared as it pulled away. Maigret's thoughts sharpened. A car. Expensive. The mayor's clandestine meetings. The man's strange accent. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still too much missing, too many unknowns." He stood, his eyes scanning the room once more. "Thank you, Madame Mayor. This has been helpful." She stood as well, her movements slow and deliberate. "I hope you find the answers," she said quietly. "For everyone's sake." As Maigret walked toward the door, he paused, glancing back at her. "One more thing," he said. "If you remember anything at all, don't hesitate to contact me." She nodded, and Maigret could see the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. He knew she would remember more eventually. It was only a matter of time before the truth found its way to the surface. Outside, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, the air heavy with the scent of wet pavement. The streets of Montargis seemed quieter now, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Maigret stood on the steps of the house, his coat collar turned up against the damp, and looked across the street. There was something off about this whole situation. Too many contradictions, too many hidden corners. The murder was only a part of it. The truth lay somewhere deeper, in the spaces between the words, in the silence between the meetings. Lognon was waiting for him by the car, his expression tense. "What now, Inspector?" he asked as Maigret approached. Maigret opened the door, settling into the car with a quiet sigh. "Now we follow the man with the strange accent," he said, his voice steady. "We find out who he is and what he wanted from the mayor, and we don't stop until we have our answers." Lognon nodded, his eyes widening slightly. "But where do we even begin?" Maigret smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "We begin by listening carefully, Lognon. Sometimes the answers come from the smallest of details." As the car pulled away, Maigret's mind worked with calm efficiency, sifting through the fragments of the case, seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. He knew that sooner or later, the man with the strange accent would reveal himself, and when he did, the truth of the mayor's death would finally be laid bare. The car rolled steadily through the rain-slicked streets, the tires making a soft, rhythmic sound against the pavement. Maigret sat in silence, his mind working methodically through the web of connections and half-hidden truths that seemed to be multiplying with every step of the investigation. He knew that somewhere in Montargis, someone was waiting to be found, a figure in the shadows, someone whose actions had set this whole tragedy in motion. And Maigret was determined to find them. Lognon was uncharacteristically quiet beside him, clearly still absorbing the weight of the case. The young inspector's eyes flickered nervously as he glanced at his superior, eager for direction. Maigret could feel the tension in the car, the sense of urgency that had begun to build in the hours since they had first walked into the mayor's office. The case was no longer just a murder. It was an intricate puzzle with pieces that had been deliberately scattered, each one designed to mislead and confuse. "We need to start with the man who visited the mayor," Maigret said, breaking the silence, his voice calm but resolute. "The one with the strange accent. He's our key." Lognon nodded, eager to follow the lead, but Maigret could see that his mind was still spinning, trying to connect the dots. "But how do we find him, sir?" "All we know is that he's tall, has a strange accent, and drives an expensive car." "That's not much to go on." Maigret gave a faint smile, the corners of his mouth turning slightly upward. "It's more than you think, Lognon. We know his car, and in a town like Montargis, people notice expensive cars. We'll start by talking to the locals. Someone will have seen something. Someone always does." Lognon's eyes brightened at the suggestion, a spark of energy returning to him. "Right, the locals." As they approached the center of Montargis, Maigret's thoughts drifted back to the mayor's widow. He had sensed her reluctance, the way she had danced around the truth without ever quite denying it. She had known more than she was letting on, but he suspected that even she wasn't fully aware of all the intricacies of her husband's dealings. People like the mayor, powerful, influential, yet enigmatic, often lived in a world of half-truths, and Maigret knew he would have to navigate that world with the utmost care. They arrived at the small café on the corner of the square, where Maigret had often spent quiet evenings, watching the world pass by. It was here that the investigation would continue, not in the sterile confines of the mayor's office or the widow's house, but in the pulse of the town itself. Maigret knew that Montargis was a place of secrets, but also of people who observed everything. In a town this small, gossip traveled quickly, and no detail was too insignificant to escape notice. Maigret stepped out of the car and walked toward the café, Lognon following closely behind. The door creaked open, and the warm glow of the café's interior enveloped them. The chatter of the few patrons sitting at the table stilled for a moment as they entered, but Maigret paid it no mind. He had no interest in the room's silence. He was focused on the subtle movements of the people inside, the way their eyes shifted toward him, the way their hands faltered mid-motion as they glanced at each other. He approached the counter where the cafe's owner, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a knowing smile, stood polishing a glass. "Good evening, Madame Lemoine," he said, his voice steady but warm. She looked up at him, her lips curving into a slight smile. "Inspector Maigret," she said, nodding in recognition. "It's not every day we have the police in here. What can I do for you?" "I'm looking for information," Maigret replied, his tone casual but purposeful. "About a man who's been around recently, a tall man with a strange accent. He's been visiting the mayor. Have you seen anyone like him? A man who might stand out?" Madame Lemoine's expression didn't change, but Maigret could see the shift in her eyes, the brief flicker of recognition. He waited, allowing the silence to hang between them, knowing that she would speak when she was ready. People like Madame Lemoine didn't give up information easily. It had to be coaxed from them, like water from a well. After a moment she spoke, her voice low. "I've seen him," she said. "A tall man, yes, with dark hair. He came by a few times. I remember because he always ordered the same thing, a glass of red wine, no more, no less. And he had that accent. I couldn't place it, but it wasn't from around here." Maigret nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. "When was the last time you saw him?" She thought for a moment, then shrugged. "A few nights ago, I think. He left in a hurry, got into an expensive car. I've seen him before, always around the same time, but I never paid much attention to him until now." Maigret smiled faintly, his mind already moving. "Did he ever speak with anyone? Did you notice anything unusual?" Madame Lemoine's brow furrowed as she considered. "Not much. He never stayed long, but there was one thing. One time he seemed nervous. He kept looking out the window as if expecting someone. And then, just like that, he got up and left. It was strange. But that's all I know." Maigret's thoughts churned as he processed the information. The man had been nervous, waiting for someone. That was a detail he hadn't expected, one that could lead to something more. He had been meeting with the mayor, and now he had been seen acting strangely, waiting for an unknown person. This was no coincidence. The pieces were beginning to connect, even if just faintly. "Thank you, Madame Lemoine," Maigret said, placing a small coin on the counter. "Your help is appreciated." She nodded, and as Maigret turned to leave, he felt Lognon's eager presence behind him. They stepped back out into the evening, the rain now a soft drizzle, the streets quiet and still. "Do you think he'll lead us to something, sir?" Lognon asked, his voice tinged with hope. Maigret glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "He's already leading us, Lognon. We just need to follow carefully." And as they walked through the rain-drenched streets, Maigret's mind worked relentlessly, turning over each new detail. The tall man, the nervousness, the expensive car. They were getting closer, he could feel it. And the truth, quiet, hidden, waiting in the shadows, was beginning to reveal itself. The evening deepened as Maigret and Lognon moved through the narrow streets of Montargis, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the soft patter of rain. The air felt thick with anticipation, and Maigret could sense that something was shifting, that the investigation had reached a crucial point. The pieces were still scattered, but now, for the first time, they were beginning to fit together, like a jigsaw puzzle that had been frustratingly incomplete for days. Lognon walked beside him, his face lit with a faint excitement that Maigret couldn't entirely share. The young inspector had a tendency to rush, eager to bring the case to its conclusion, but Maigret knew better. There was no shortcut to understanding. It was the quiet moments, the small revelations that mattered most. They arrived at the edge of the town, where the houses gave way to a darker, quieter stretch of road. Maigret had made a mental note of the car the man with the strange accent had been driving. A sleek, black sedan that hadn't stood out in the way one might expect, but it had been parked near the mayor's office on the night of the murder. He had questioned Madame Lemoine, and her recollections had provided another clue. The man was not just a visitor to the town hall, but someone who had come and gone with an almost calculated precision. "We need to follow the car," Maigret said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Let's see where it leads." Lognon blinked, clearly startled by the suggestion. You think he's still in town? We're not sure where he went after the cafe. We'll find him, Maigret said simply. People always return to where they feel safe. The car will lead us back to him. Without waiting for a reply, Maigret stepped into the street, his coat pulled tight against the drizzle. He knew that Lognon would follow without hesitation, even if the young man was still trying to piece together exactly what Maigret had in mind. Maigret, for his part, wasn't entirely sure either, but he trusted his instincts. The investigation had already revealed the man's pattern. He was methodical, like the mayor had been in his final days. That precision, that quiet waiting had to mean something. They turned a corner and passed a row of shops that were now closed for the night. The quiet hum of the town had taken on an almost eerie quality, as if the streets were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Maigret could feel it too, the tension in the air, the sense that they were on the verge of a breakthrough. But there was still that last step, the moment when everything would finally make sense. They reached the town's outskirts, where the road dipped into a shadowed alley that led toward a large, inconspicuous building. Maigret slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the darkened windows. He had a hunch, one that had been brewing in the back of his mind since the cafe. The man with the strange accent wasn't just visiting the mayor. He was connected to the town in some way. And Maigret was beginning to suspect that the key to the puzzle lay in that connection. "I've seen this place before," Lognon muttered as he caught up with Maigret. "It's the old warehouse district, isn't it? There's nothing here but abandoned buildings." Maigret nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Exactly. And that's what makes it interesting. People don't come here unless they have a reason that's not for the public eye." They continued walking, the shadows of the warehouses looming over them like silent sentinels. As they passed one building, Maigret's sharp eyes caught sight of a familiar silhouette in the distance, a figure stepping from the shadows and into a side door of a building at the far end of the alley. "There he is," Maigret said softly, his voice low with the satisfaction of a discovery. "The man with the accent." Lognon stiffened, his eyes wide with realization. "We should move quickly then." Maigret held up a hand, signaling for Lognon to hold back. "No, we wait." Lognon looked at him, confused. "Wait?" "Without patience," Maigret said, his voice calm and steady. "We can't rush this. He's just entered a building, but he's not our immediate concern." Not yet. They found a quiet spot in the alley to wait, staying out of sight but keeping the building in view. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one measured with the same quiet precision Maigret had learned to value over the years. He wasn't interested in charging in recklessly. He wanted to understand. He wanted to know who this man was, what he wanted from the mayor and how he fit into the larger picture. After what felt like an eternity, Maigret saw a light flicker through a window, then go dark again. A shadow moved inside, and for a moment, the stillness of the night was broken by the faintest sound of a door creaking open. Someone was leaving the building, moving cautiously, as if aware of being watched. Maigret's eyes narrowed as he saw the figure emerge from the building, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakable. It was the man they had been following, and now he was walking directly toward them. Maigret didn't flinch. He remained where he was, his hands relaxed at his sides, waiting for the right moment. The man passed by them, his steps slow and deliberate, his head down, not looking in their direction. It was then that Maigret noticed the subtle flick of a hand at the man's pocket. "A movement too quick for someone without practice. He's carrying something," Maigret murmured to Lognon. Lognon tensed, but Maigret held him back again. "No, not yet." The man turned a corner and disappeared into the night, his figure swallowed by the darkened streets. Maigret didn't move at once. He waited, listening to the sounds of the town, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. There was a pattern here, one that was becoming clearer with each passing moment. The man was involved in something far deeper than a simple political murder, and Maigret was determined to uncover it piece by piece. "Let's go," Maigret said at last, his voice steady and resolute. "We'll follow him, but carefully. He's not just a man with a strange accent. He's part of something much bigger." They stepped out from the shadows, their footsteps silent in the damp alley. As they continued to follow the man who held the answers, they were so desperately seeking. Maigret and Lognon moved with careful precision, their footsteps muffled by the damp streets as they kept their distance from the man ahead. The alley had grown darker, the shadows stretching long across the narrow lanes, and the sound of the man's footsteps grew fainter as he walked with purpose, unaware of the two figures silently trailing behind him. Maigray's mind worked with quiet efficiency, sorting through the fragments of the investigation, aligning them even as the rain began to pick up again, the soft patter on the cobblestones a reminder of how small, hidden moments often held the key to larger truths. The man didn't seem to be in any particular rush, yet his movements were deliberate, as though he had a destination in mind. He paused for a moment, near a tall wrought-iron gate that seemed to lead into an industrial complex, the heavy doors rusted and worn. Maigret observed the man's body language. He was scanning the area, cautious, as though he knew he might be watched. But there was no one else in the vicinity, just the quiet hum of the town in the late hour, interrupted only by the distant sound of cars passing in the streets beyond. "Is he going in there?" Lognon whispered, his voice barely audible. Maigret didn't respond immediately. Instead, he kept his focus on the man, watching as he approached the gate and tried the handle. It creaked in protest but gave way, allowing the man to slip inside. He paused again, looking around one last time before vanishing into the dark behind the gate. Without a word, Maigret turned to Lognon. "Stay here," he murmured. "I'll go ahead." Lognon nodded, his face taut with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Maigret could see the impatience in his eyes, the urge to act, but he understood that this was a moment for patience, not haste. The game had changed. They weren't just chasing a suspect now. They were entering the web the man had carefully woven. Maigret moved quickly, but silently, towards the gate, careful to stay in the shadows. He crouched beside the rusted bars, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement inside the darkened yard. The sounds of the man's footsteps had disappeared, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the complex. The area was silent, save for the occasional drip of water from the eaves of the buildings that loomed overhead, their outlines barely visible in the dim light. He reached for the gate's handle, giving it a cautious twist. It was a rusty, stiff mechanism, but it yielded after a moment of quiet effort. The gate swung open with a soft groan, barely audible over the sound of the rain. Maigret stepped inside, slipping past the rusted edges and into the yard. The industrial complex, now partially revealed, was a place in decay. Crates and containers were stacked haphazardly, some marked with faded letters that had long since lost their meaning. Metal scaffolding reached upward, like skeletal remains of a structure once intended for something more. A few old vehicles, their bodies rusted and cracked, sat abandoned near the back of the yard, shrouded in shadows. Maigret's senses were heightened, but his movements were measured, deliberate. He moved quietly, staying low, using the containers as cover as he searched for the man. Through a narrow gap in the cluttered structures, he caught a glimpse of movement, there, in the far corner of the yard. The man was speaking to someone, a figure dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by a hood. The conversation was low, the words too soft for Maigret to hear. But he could see the gestures, the way the man handed something over, a small exchange. It was quick, almost too quick, but Maigret knew it was significant. His instincts kicked in. He had seen this before, the hurried exchanges, the careful secrecy. It was a deal. One that had been hidden under the guise of business, but it was more than that. The man with the strange accent wasn't just meeting with the mayor. He was involved in something far darker, something far more dangerous. Maigret moved closer, his steps silent on the wet ground, keeping his body low to avoid detection. He was just about to take another step when the distant sound of tires screeching echoed in the alley behind him. It was faint, but enough to cause Maigret to pause. His instincts told him to move back, to retreat before anyone noticed him. He didn't look back. Instead, he ducked behind a large crate and waited, still as a statue, listening. The sound of the car grew louder, then faded away, but Maigret wasn't convinced. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he knew that whoever was behind the wheel was looking for something. Or someone. The conversation ahead continued, and Maigret shifted his focus back to the two men. The figure with the hood had turned to walk away, disappearing into the night. The man with the accent stood still for a moment, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He glanced around one last time, checking for signs of anyone watching. Then, with deliberate steps, he turned and headed toward a narrow alley to the side of the complex. Maigret didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, staying just far enough behind to avoid being seen. The rain had picked up again, the droplets heavier now, but it worked in Maigret's favor, masking his footsteps as he trailed the man through the winding alleys of the industrial complex. The alley led them into a small, dimly lit street that Maigret knew well. It was a part of Montargis that few people passed through, a place where only the desperate or the secretive dared to walk at night. The man with the accent stopped at a door tucked between two crumbling buildings. Without looking around, he knocked twice, a quick, sharp rap, and the door opened just enough for him to slip inside. Maigret paused a few steps back, watching the door close behind him. The man had entered without hesitation, as though he knew exactly where he was going. Maigret's gaze narrowed. This wasn't just a man on the run. It was someone with a purpose, someone who had planned every movement with the utmost care. He stood there for a moment, contemplating his next move. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but he still didn't have all the answers. The man with the accent had connections, and those connections were tied to the mayor's murder. Of that Maigret was certain, but there was still one more question that lingered. Who was behind all of this? Who was the mastermind pulling the strings? Maigret knew that finding the answer would mean going deeper into the heart of Montargis, into the places where secrets festered and power played out in shadows. For now, though, the next step was clear. He would have to confront the man behind that door, find out what he knew, and learn exactly how the mayor's death fit into the larger picture. Maigret stepped forward, his resolve hardening. The investigation was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Maigret stood for a moment, hidden in the shadows of the alley, observing the door that had closed behind the man with the strange accent. The rain continued its steady fall, the street now a blur of dark shadows and muted sounds. His mind churned, piecing together the fragments of the case. So many small scattered details that now seemed to be converging in this quiet, forgotten part of Montargis. But Maigret knew better than to rush. Patience was his most reliable tool, and he had learned over the years that the smallest observation could lead to the largest revelation. He took a slow breath, letting the rain cool the thoughts swirling in his head. The man had entered the building with deliberate care, as if he knew it was a place of safety, a place where he wouldn't be disturbed. It was clear that the man wasn't just a passerby or an opportunist. He was someone embedded in something far deeper. Maigret was certain now. The murder of the mayor was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Moving silently, he approached the door. It was unremarkable, plain, weather-worn, a little too ordinary. Maigret tested the handle. It was locked, but the lock didn't seem sturdy. The soft click of the mechanism as he twisted the handle suggested a lock that hadn't been maintained in years. With a quiet, practiced motion, he drew his coat tighter around him, pulled the handle gently, and pushed the door open just a crack. Inside, the building smelled of damp wood and dust, the air heavy and stale. A narrow hallway stretched before him, lit dimly by a flickering light from a bare bulb. Maigret could hear the muffled sound of voices coming from deeper within. He moved cautiously, his footsteps soundless as he crept forward, the faint whispers growing clearer the closer he got. He paused just before the door at the end of the hall, listening. The voices were low but distinct. Two men, one of them was the man with the strange accent. The other, Maigret assumed, was the person he had been meeting in the industrial complex. Their conversation was clipped, tense, and they were speaking in a language Maigret didn't recognize immediately. It wasn't until the words switched back to French that he caught the key phrases. "We can't delay this any longer," the stranger with the accent said, his voice laced with urgency. "The mayor's death has stirred things up more than we anticipated. If we don't act soon, we'll lose everything." The other man responded, his voice more calculated, steady. "You're being too hasty. We have a plan. Rushing it will only make things worse." Maigret's fingers curled slightly around the edge of the doorframe, his focus narrowing. The conversation was about more than just the mayor's death. It was about something bigger, something being orchestrated in the shadows. Maigret knew it was only a matter of time before the true scope of the conspiracy revealed itself. The mayor was just a piece, one of many players in a much larger game. "The letter," the stranger continued, "we need to find it before it's too late. If they get their hands on it, "I know," the other man interrupted, his voice sharp now. "But it's not just the letter. It's everything else. We need to control the narrative, get the right people on our side. Once we do that, the rest will fall into place." There was a long pause, and Maigret held his breath, straining to catch every word. The letter. This was the first time he had heard it mentioned directly, but it had been alluded to in fragments throughout the investigation, the key that had been hidden in the mayor's office. It was obvious now. This letter contained something dangerous, something that could unravel whatever plans these men were working on. But what was it? "I'll handle it," the man with the accent said after a moment, his tone final. "But we need to move fast. Time is running out." The conversation ended abruptly, and Maigret quickly retreated into the shadows, his mind racing. The letter was the crux of it all. Whatever it contained, whatever it meant, it was the piece that held the entire operation together. Maigret knew now that the murder of the mayor was only the beginning. Whoever was behind it, whoever was pulling the strings, wanted this letter badly enough to risk everything. Maigret turned, careful to make no sound, as he made his way back to the alley, his thoughts already shifting to the next steps. He needed to know where the letter was, who had it, and how it was connected to the mysterious figure he had just overheard. The men he had just listened to weren't the only ones involved. There was a whole network, and Maigret was determined to follow it to the end. No matter where it led, Lognon was waiting where Maigret had left him, standing at the edge of the alley, his eyes scanning the street with impatience. "Did you learn anything, sir?" Lognon asked, his voice low but with a trace of urgency. Maigret nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "Yes, the man with the accent is part of something much larger. The mayor's death was only one piece of the puzzle. They're after a letter, something that could destroy everything they've worked for. We need to find that letter, Lognon." Lognon's brow furrowed. "The letter? But we don't even know where it is." "No," Maigret replied quietly, "but we know who does." He turned and started walking, his pace steady, his mind already working out the next move. They needed to find the man with the accent, the one who had been so careful, so deliberate in every step. They needed to find the letter. And most of all, they needed to understand what it meant to the people who would go to such lengths to possess it. Maigret knew one thing for certain: the story of the mayor's death was far from over. It was just beginning, and the truth was about to reveal itself piece by piece. In the quiet corners of Montargis, Maigret walked briskly down the dimly lit street, Lognon trailing a few steps behind, his quiet footsteps matching the rhythm of his superiors. The air had grown colder, the dampness of the night seeping into their clothes, but Maigret paid little attention to the chill. His mind was occupied with the growing web of intrigue surrounding the mayor's death, the letter, and the shadowy figures who seemed to be pulling all the strings. It was clear that the murder was only the surface of something much larger, something far more dangerous. Lognon's restlessness was palpable, his impatience bubbling to the surface. "What's our next move, sir? Do we go after the man with the accent?" Maigret didn't answer immediately, allowing the question to hang in the air. He could feel the young inspector's eagerness to act, to pursue the case with urgency. But Maigret knew that caution was the key. Every step had to be calculated. Every move had to be deliberate. "No," Maigret said at last, his voice quiet but firm. "We wait." Lognon's brow furrowed. "Wait. But, sir, we've gathered everything we can from the people in town. We know where he's been. He's the key to all of this." Maigret turned slightly to look at his colleague, his expression unreadable. "We're not ready yet, Lognon. We know where he's been, but we don't know where he's going. The letter, the one he and the others are after, is still hidden. We need to understand more before we make our move. Lognon didn't respond, but Maigret could tell that the young man was frustrated. His energy, his eagerness to rush forward, was a trait Maigret had seen in many young detectives, and it was often the thing that led to mistakes. Maigret had learned long ago that patience was the most important virtue in solving a case like this. Rushing into a situation without fully understanding it was a mistake that could cost them everything. They reached the corner where the narrow street met the main road, the lights of the town stretching out before them. Maigret paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the familiar surroundings. Montargis was a quiet town, the kind of place where secrets were easily buried beneath the surface of everyday life. But Maigret knew that those secrets had a way of emerging, no matter how deep they were hidden. He turned back to Lognon. The man with the accent has been too careful. We need to find out more about his connections, who he's meeting, who he's working with. The letter is the key to all of this, but it's not just the letter we need to worry about. It's the people who want it. Lognon nodded, though he still looked unsure. So what's the plan, sir? We start by finding out who else is involved, Maigret replied, his voice steady. We need to go back to the beginning, back to the people who were close to the mayor. We need to understand the network he was a part of, the people who might have had access to the letter. They continued down the street, the rain beginning to fall in heavier sheets, the sound of the water against the pavement drowning out their footsteps. Maigret's thoughts were sharp, focused, his mind running through the names and faces he had encountered since the start of the investigation. The mayor's widow had already provided some insight, but there were others, people who had been in the mayor's life, people who might know more than they were letting on. The first stop was the office of the local newspaper. It was a small, unassuming building, tucked away on the far end of town. The light inside was still on, the glow of the desk lamp spilling out through the window. Maigret had a sense that the answers they were looking for were here, hidden in the archives or the back room where the reporters worked late into the night. They entered through the back door, and the familiar scent of old paper and ink filled the air. The office was quiet, save for the faint sound of a typewriter tapping away in the corner. Maigret knew the editor, a sharp-eyed man named Bernard, who had worked in Montargis for years. He was a man who had a knack for knowing things, often more than he should. Maigret approached the desk where Bernard sat, his brow furrowed in concentration as he sifted through a pile of papers. The moment he saw Maigret, he looked up, his face breaking into a quick smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Inspector," Bernard said, his voice low, "what brings you here at this hour?" "We need to talk," Maigret replied, his tone businesslike. "About the mayor's death." Bernard's smile faded slightly, and he set down the paper he was holding. "You've come to the right place, I suppose. It's all anyone's been talking about. But I don't know what more I can tell you, Inspector. We're all still in shock around here. The mayor's death was unexpected." Maigret's gaze hardened. "You've been working here for a long time, Bernard. You've seen the people who come and go in this town. Do you know what goes on behind the scenes?" Bernard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't know what you mean." Maigret leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, steady tone. "I'm not here to waste your time. There are people involved in this case, people with their own agendas. The mayor's death was just one part of it. There's a letter, one that's being hidden, and I believe someone here knows about it. Someone close to the mayor." Bernard's eyes flickered, a brief moment of recognition passing across his face. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then paused, looking down at his hands. He didn't answer right away. Maigret waited, watching him closely. He could see the internal struggle, the moment when someone decided whether to share the truth or keep it hidden. Finally, Bernard sighed, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "I don't know about any letter, Inspector, but I do know this. There were people who came to see the mayor, people who weren't exactly his friends. They came late at night, after everyone else had gone home. They didn't want to be seen. I know that much. I saw them. There were meetings, quiet ones, in the back office." Maigret's mind raced. "Do you know who these people were? What they wanted?" Bernard shook his head, looking defeated. "No names, no details, just faces. But I can tell you one thing. There's always someone watching, always someone with a reason to be there. And I think they're still watching." Maigret stood up, his eyes narrowing as he processed the new information. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. They had been close all along. This wasn't just a murder. It was a power struggle, one that had been brewing for some time. And the key to understanding it all lay in the hands of those who had been closest to the mayor. He turned to Lognon, his expression hardening. "We're going to find those people. And when we do, we'll have our answers." They left the office and stepped back into the rain, the weight of the night settling over them. Maigret could feel the momentum building, the case coming to a head. They were closer now, closer than they had ever been, and soon the truth would be laid bare for all to see. The rain had become a constant presence, drenching the streets of Montargis in a cold, oppressive blanket. Maigret's thoughts churned as he and Lognon made their way back through the town, their footsteps muffled by the dampness of the road. Bernard's words echoed in Maigray's mind, fragments of information that seemed to hold more weight now. The mayor's death wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far deeper, something that would require careful navigation to uncover. The journalist's cryptic mention of late-night meetings and secretive figures had confirmed what Maigret already suspected. There was more to the mayor's life than the public saw, and those shadows were starting to creep into the investigation. The mention of faces without names, people who hid in plain sight, sent a chill through him. People like that didn't leave trails, but Maigret was determined to find them. "Where do we go from here, sir?" Longyon's voice broke through the silence, his tone cautious but still tinged with that eagerness to solve the case. He was still hungry for answers, but Maigret could see the weight of uncertainty in his eyes now. The investigation was no longer a matter of simply solving a murder. It was a matter of unearthing secrets that could shatter the town. "We start by talking to the people who were close to the mayor," Maigret replied, his voice steady, his mind already working. "We need to understand what was happening behind the scenes. There are people in this town who know more than they've let on." Longyon nodded, but didn't speak again, sensing that his superior was lost in his thoughts. They walked in silence, the wet pavement gleaming under the pale glow of the streetlights. It was almost midnight now, and the town had quieted further, the usual bustle of the day replaced by the stillness of the night. Maigret knew that this quietness was deceptive. It always was. Beneath the surface, the gears of the investigation were still turning, slowly but inevitably. They reached the outskirts of town, where the buildings grew sparse, and Maigret turned toward a narrow lane. It was one of the older parts of Montargis, an area where the town's history could still be felt in the worn cobblestones and crumbling facades of forgotten houses. It was here that Maigret intended to speak with someone who might have answers, someone who had known the mayor in ways that most people hadn't. The house was small, modest, but well kept. The front door was adorned with a small brass knocker, the kind that had been used for generations. Maigret paused for a moment before knocking, his knuckles rapping lightly against the wood. They waited, the silence hanging between them. It wasn't long before the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 50s, her face lined with the years but still sharp and alert. Her eyes fixed on Maigret with a quiet intensity, a look that suggested she knew exactly who he was and why he had come. "Inspector Maigret," she said, her voice low but firm. "I've been expecting you." Maigret gave a small nod, stepping forward into the dimly lit hallway. "Madame Durand," he said, recognizing her immediately. "I'm sorry to trouble you so late. I need to ask you about your late husband." Madame Durand's expression softened slightly, a flicker of sadness crossing her features. "I don't know what you think you'll find, Inspector," she said quietly, "but if it's about the mayor, I can't help you. My husband's dealings were complicated." "Complicated?" Maigret regarded her carefully, his gaze unwavering. "I know your husband had a relationship with the mayor. He was one of the few people who kept close ties to him, despite the mayor's increasing isolation in his final months. I'm trying to understand the mayor's life, Madame Durand. What was he involved in?" She stepped back from the door, motioning for them to enter. "Come in," she said, her voice tinged with resignation. "But I can't promise you any answers. You might not like what you find." Inside, the house was quiet, the soft hum of the old radiator filling the room as they settled into a modest sitting area. Madame Durand took a seat opposite Maigret, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't offer tea or pleasantries. There was no need for them. This was a conversation that had been years in the making, one that had only now come to the surface. "I knew my husband had his secrets," she began slowly, "but I didn't know the full extent of them until after his death. He never talked about his dealings with the mayor, but I could tell when something was wrong. There was always a tension in the air, a sense that he was involved in something he couldn't explain." Maigret leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. "What kind of tension? What exactly did you see?" Madame Durand's gaze dropped to her hands. He'd received strange visitors, men who didn't belong to the usual circles of the town. They came at odd hours, sometimes late at night, sometimes in the early mornings. My husband always made sure the meetings were private. He was protective of whatever was happening, but it was obvious it wasn't just business. There was something more. Maigret's mind raced. These late-night meetings, the secretive visitors. This was exactly what he had been looking for. The mayor's life had been far from simple, and the truth was buried beneath layers of secrecy. Did you ever hear what they talked about? Or see what they were doing? Maigret asked, his voice steady, but his eyes searching hers for any hint of hesitation. She looked up at him, her expression hardening. I never knew the full details, but I know enough to understand that they were up to something dangerous. My husband tried to keep me away from it. But one night, I saw him arguing with one of them, a man with a thick accent much like the one you're chasing. They were arguing about something and my husband was frightened. He kept saying, "It's not just a letter. It's everything." I don't know what it meant, but I remember that moment. I remember the fear in his eyes. Maigret sat back in his chair, his mind working quickly. The letter wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of something far larger. And now it seemed that even Madame Durand had been kept in the dark, just as the mayor's closest associates had been. But the pieces were coming together. The man with the accent, the letter, the secrecy. It was all linked, and Maigret knew that whatever the letter contained, it was something powerful enough to drive people to murder. The mayor had been involved in something far more dangerous than simple politics, and Maigret was getting closer to unraveling it. "Thank you, Madame Durand," Maigret said, his voice quiet with gratitude. "You've given me more than I had before." She nodded, her gaze distant now, as though she had released a burden that had weighed on her for years. "I wish I could have done more." Maigret stood, tipping his hat to her, as he and Lognon made their way back to the door. The night had deepened further, and the rain had turned to a steady drizzle. But Maigret felt the first stirrings of clarity. The mayor's death, the mysterious letter, the network of people hidden in the shadows, it was all coming into focus, and he knew, without a doubt, that the final piece was within reach. The rain had finally begun to ease, leaving the streets of Montargis damp but quiet under the glow of the streetlights. The weight of the investigation hung heavily on Maigret as he and Lognon walked toward the final destination, the place where everything would come together. They had gathered the pieces of the puzzle, each clue building toward an inevitable conclusion. The mayor's death, the mysterious letter, the shadowy figures, the truth was within their grasp. Maigret's thoughts were sharp, his mind still turning over the words of Madame Durand. "It's not just a letter, it's everything." The phrase had haunted him ever since she'd spoken it. What was it about the letter that made it so important, so dangerous that it had led to murder? The answers were finally beginning to take shape, and Maigret knew that this was the moment of reckoning. They reached the edge of town, where the old factory loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette outlined against the faint glow of the horizon. This was the place. Maigret had followed the trail here, the man with the accent's movements leading them to this very spot. The factory had been abandoned for years, left to rot in the shadows, but it was clear now that this crumbling relic was where the final pieces of the puzzle lay. As they neared the entrance, Maigret motioned for Lognon to stay back. He approached the rusted gates with deliberate care, his instincts telling him to proceed cautiously. He had no doubt that whoever was inside knew he was coming. The tension had been building for days, and now it would all culminate here, in the place where the truth would finally be revealed. The factory door creaked open with a protest, revealing a large, dimly lit room. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay and neglect, the ground littered with debris. In the far corner a figure stood, his back to Maigret. The man with the accent, the one who had been the key to unlocking the entire mystery. "You've come, Inspector," the man said, his voice cold, yet carrying a hint of weary recognition. "I knew you would eventually find your way here." Maigret took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the man. "I've been following the trail for days. I know what you've been hiding, but now I need to know why." The man turned slowly, revealing the sharp lines of his face, the unmistakable glint of something darker in his eyes. "Why? Because there are some things worth protecting, Inspector. Some things that have the power to destroy everything. You wouldn't understand." Maigret's eyes narrowed. "I understand more than you think. The mayor's death wasn't just a random act. It was about power, about control. And that letter, you've been protecting it because it holds the truth. The truth about everything." The man's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You're too late. The letter's already been hidden, buried in a place you'll never find. And the people behind this? They'll stop at nothing to keep it from being uncovered." Maigret stepped closer, his voice unwavering. No, it's not buried. It's in plain sight. The letter is just the beginning. It's the names, the connections, the network that's been hiding in the shadows. You thought you could bury it all, but the truth always comes out one way or another. The man's expression faltered for the briefest of moments, a crack in his carefully maintained facade. But it was enough. Maigret could see it now, the fear, the uncertainty. He had been protecting something far more dangerous than he realized, and it was only a matter of time before it unraveled. "Where is it?" Maigret demanded. "Where is the letter?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting to the shadows of the room as if seeking an escape. But Maigret knew there was no way out. The walls were closing in. "You won't find it," the man finally said, his voice resigned. "It's been destroyed." The letter was never meant to be found. It was a tool, a piece of leverage, and now it's gone. Maigret's heart skipped a beat. "Destroyed? You're lying." The man shrugged, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "Do you think they'd let me keep it? Do you think anyone could?" Maigret took a long breath, his mind racing. The letter was gone, but the truth didn't lie in the letter. It never had. The letter had been a tool, a bargaining chip, a symbol of something far more insidious, an entire system built on power and manipulation, hidden in the open for those who were willing to look. Maigret stepped forward again, his eyes never leaving the man's. "You don't need the letter to know the truth. It's in the people you've been hiding in the shadows, in the deals you've made, the lives you've ruined. And now it's over." The man's face crumpled as he realized the game was up. He had spent so long running, hiding behind lies and deceit, but now the truth was out. The network was exposed. The people behind the mayor's death would be brought to justice. And it wasn't the letter that had given them away. It was their own arrogance, their own belief that they could control everything. "Call them," Maigret said, his voice quiet but commanding. "Tell them it's over." "You've failed." The man hesitated, his eyes shifting to the shadows once more, but there was no escape. He was caught in the web he had helped weave. Maigret stood still, watching as the man slowly sank to his knees, his shoulders trembling. The final act was over. The truth had come to light, and with it the entire network of corruption was set to crumble. The mayor's death had been the spark, but it was the people behind it, the ones who had manipulated the system for their own gain, who would now face the consequences. As the man finally spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper, Maigret knew that justice had been served. "You've won, Inspector. But it won't matter. There are always more." Maigret gave a small, bitter smile. "Perhaps. But tonight, at least, the truth has been revealed." As he turned and walked out of the factory, the first light of dawn began to break through the clouds, casting a pale glow over Montargis. The investigation had come to an end. The mystery was solved, and the pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. And for Maigret there would always be more questions, more mysteries. But for now, the weight of the night had lifted. He had found the answers he sought, and justice had been served. Justice had been